In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Will Teasle, the sheriff and antagonist of the first Rambo film, First Blood. Special thanks to the user known as T1000 for suggesting this character. While the Rambo franchise has been largely regarded as just a bunch of action movies, especially with the later entries, First Blood remains a sobering tale about a traumatized veteran struggling to find his place back in civilization. On another note, the film also shows how a small situation can be needlessly blown up into all-out destruction when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. On one hand, we have Rambo, a war veteran still dealing with the effects of PTSD and in an emotionally dire state after learning of the recent passing of his comrade. On the other, we have Sheriff Teasle, who started off with sincere intentions, but his character flaws result in him drawing first blood, as per the film's title, and ends up causing much of the chaos in the film. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Teasle's mindset, his personality, and the arising flaws which make for him as the film's antagonist. The first striking thing about Teasle is his authoritarian style of control. As the sheriff of the small town of Hope, he is the big fish in a small pond. He appears friendly and polite and displays a good rapport with the citizens as seen by his interactions with them. But this rapport is likely built on him exerting his will over them with unquestioned obedience. This style of control is hinted at in his interaction with one of the citizens when he suggests to him to take a bath. This might seem like an insignificant detail, but perhaps this request is indicative of the level of control he frequently imposes. But the pinnacle of Teasle's obsessive control is found in two phrases which he says frequently throughout the film. The first being the phrase, "This is my town," and the second being the affirmation of, "I am the law." Both phrases are somewhat troubling, but more so for the second, as whenever someone claims to be the embodiment of the law, it's likely that something's off with that person. Teasle's high level of control and his misuse of the law go hand in hand. Since he has absolute power in such a small town, he is inclined to bend the law however he chooses. After all, since he feels he is the law, he decides what goes. There are multiple instances of this in his dealings with Rambo, but another brief moment reveals Teasle's bending of the law. When he decides to start the manhunt for Rambo later, he instructs his men to request for helicopters from a civilian, and Teasle then tells them to use the threat of obstruction of justice if the request doesn't go through for whatever reason. So we can see from this that Teasle is used to getting his way, and if he doesn't, it's not beneath him to bend the law for his own agenda. As for his interactions with Rambo, Teasle sees him as a drifter, one who could possibly cause trouble in his town. It's a sad but true fact that in the 70s, veterans didn't receive as much support as they do now, and thus they had an even more difficult time adapting back to being civilians. It's not too far of a stretch to imagine that Teasle may have had unpleasant encounters with veterans in the past, and therefore his goal is to make sure their stay in his town is as short as possible. His intention to remove Rambo is understandable, but his decision to unceremoniously kick him out is not. Walking around town is not a crime, because if it was, he would have to arrest every visitor who steps foot inside. Teasle comments on Rambo's military jacket, mentioning the flag as if he disapproves of it. But that is no offense either, as the same flag is worn by him on his own police jacket. Rambo was just passing through, but at a certain point, a miscommunication starts off the whole misunderstanding. Rambo mentioned earlier that he was heading north, but when he mentions he's headed to Portland, Teasle corrects him that Portland is actually south. It's more likely that Rambo was just new to the area and was still in the process of getting his bearings. But this mix-up in directions triggers Teasle's suspicions and causes him to wonder about Rambo's purpose in town. All Rambo wanted was to have a meal and head off, and perhaps if this unfortunate misunderstanding over north and south hadn't happened, Teasle might have just driven him to the nearest diner and we could roll credits. But regardless, Teasle's choice to unceremoniously drive him out was overstepping his boundaries. In response, Rambo is understandably frustrated, given that he was still dealing with the loss of his friend and walking 30 miles up the highway in his already famished state sure doesn't sound appealing. Rambo walks back into town, as is within his rights, but of course, Teasle, who sees himself as the custodian of the town, cannot accept this defiance and sees it as a personal attack on his authority. He arrests Rambo for vagrancy, which itself is doubtful as Rambo has barely been in town for more than 5 minutes. He hasn't turned up sleeping on a park bench or scavenging through rubbish bins. Perhaps the law may have been different then, or maybe the town had specific state regulations, but Teasle's arrest of Rambo appears to be unwarranted. If any of you have more insight on this, I'd be curious to read your comments down below. But as if that wasn't bad enough, Teasle makes it worse by his illegal search of Rambo. This appears to be a violation of his constitutional rights. Up till this point, Rambo had done nothing wrong and was only guilty of trying to find sustenance for his stomach. Simply put, there was no probable cause to justify a bodily search. With his ego being threatened, it's of hardly any surprise that Teasle would easily resort to bending the law to defend his pride. It's also worth noting that Teasle quickly puts his hand to his holster as a threat, signifying the excessive force that he will use later in the film. But beyond his ego, there is another element that accounts for Teasle's treatment of Rambo, albeit a more subtle one, namely his jealousy. Teasle appears to be a war veteran himself, as hinted by the collection of medals in his office later. Most likely he was a veteran from the Korean War, as explained in the novel, with his resentment towards Rambo born out of the jealousy of the Vietnam veterans stealing the spotlight from those who fought in Korea. We see hints of this jealousy later in the film after Colonel Trotman tells him of Rambo's background. Despite knowing that he is an elite soldier, a Green Beret and a decorated one no less, with the Congressional Medal of Honor, Teasle denies Rambo any respect and only labels him as a drifter guilty of vagrancy. Subsequently, when he believes Rambo to be dead, he mocks Trotman for being a sore loser and gloats over the fact that the best man lost. Unfortunately, the bending or breaking of the law isn't just limited to Teasle, but extends to his deputy Galt as well, who is undoubtedly the most evil character in the film. This time, it comes in the form of police brutality, as seen when Galt despicably strikes Rambo from behind with his baton and adds in a kick for good measure. When Teasle later meets with the state police, we learn that he has had some knowledge of this brutality, implying that it has happened before under his watch. It's quite subtle, but before Teasle replies to the state police on his deputy's brutality, he momentarily breaks eye contact and looks away, perhaps in shame, and perhaps an admission of his guilt in allowing the abuse to happen. Besides, the defense he gives is rather weak, saying that the prisoner can seek recourse with him directly if they were abused. No prisoner in their right mind would seek out the sheriff if they were already bullied by their deputy officers. As for Galt's treatment of Rambo, it's unfortunate, but at the same time it bears noting that maybe he would not have mistreated Rambo if he had been more cooperative, namely if he had not ignored Galt and responded to his questions. Again, we can't fault Rambo too much, as he is a damaged man still struggling with PTSD and in permanent fight or flight mode. But regardless, Galt's abuse of power with Rambo is still inexcusable, whether he ignored him or not. Things take a further downturn with the subsequent death of Galt, but it is a death brought on by himself, by his excessive use of force. Rambo was helplessly dangling off a cliff, and there was no need to shoot him. Later, Rambo had no choice but to throw the rock, which inadvertently caused Galt to fall to his death. Ultimately, it is Galt who is responsible for his own demise, with his attempted murder, and for foolishly taking off his seatbelt in the first place. With the death of Galt, Teasle's rage reaches new levels, to the point where he himself uses excessive force. Now granted, he doesn't know that Rambo is innocent of Galt's death, but Rambo is coming forward with both arms raised in surrender. Teasle still opens fire on Rambo, and maybe this could be construed as a warning shot, but it's unlikely. Combined with what we see later when Teasle allows the dogs to be released, they are being released to kill Rambo, which gives credence to the suggestion of his excessive force. Eventually, Teasle's fragile ego gives rise to his evil turn, after Rambo has him dead to rights and decides to spare him. Instead of being grateful for this mercy, Teasle cannot stand this humiliation, and his pride, his jealousy, and his vindictive nature overcomes him, and he crosses over from being morally questionable to downright evil. In his own words to Trotman, Teasle says, "I wanted to kill him so bad I could taste it." It's somewhat tragic, as Teasle started out with more innocent intentions, with his original plan for Rambo to just stay the night in a cell and then face a judge the next morning. It might be argued that he is simply doing his job and catching a fugitive, but that suggestion doesn't hold much weight. When Rambo escaped the police station and fled the town, Teasle could have handed the situation over to the state police, or later to Trotman when he appeared. Both parties are much more capable of handling the situation, plus they can do it with an emotionally calm mind. Teasle had plenty of chances to defuse the situation, but his ego proved to be his undoing. His evil doesn't stop there, as we find that Teasle has a manipulative side, as seen when he uses Trotman to talk Rambo down, when in actuality he is simply using their time on the radio to narrow down Rambo's location. This manipulative side is again seen later, after Rambo is thought to be killed in the cave. He appears to be somewhat remorseful over his actions, but Trotman calls out his BS and correctly points out that he is only sorry that he never got the chance to kill Rambo himself. Of course, Trotman is later proven right by Teasle's resurging enthusiasm when he learns that Rambo is still alive. But in all this, while Teasle's actions at this point are inexcusable, it also has to be said that Rambo is not guiltless here. At the end, even Trotman agrees that Rambo deserves to serve time in jail. After he was declared to be dead following the shootout at the cave, Rambo could have just walked away. The search was off and everyone thought it was all over. He didn't need to hijack a military truck, steal an M60, and then cause millions of dollars of property damage. But while his actions are wrong and cannot be endorsed, Rambo remains a sympathetic victim. A victim of PTSD, a victim of the discrimination faced by veterans, a broken and damaged man returning to a world that now rejects him. Regarding the conflict, a victim of a sheriff's ego and jealousy. If we're weighing out the guilt, Teasle has much more to bear by a long stretch. At the end, Teasle survives, but his fate is unknown, although one would hope that he would at least face the music for his drawing of First Blood with his misuse of the law. So what do you think of Sheriff Will Teasle from First Blood, folks? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked this video, check out this one here. Thanks for watching, and take care.